sound good?
Sounds good.
Perfect. Okay, so first, could you just tell me what your name is and your position here?
I'm Ken Ashley, and I'm the director of the Rivers Institute at BCIT, and I also teach in the Ecological Restoration Program at BCIT that has both a bachelor's level program and a joint master's level program delivered with, that one's delivered with Simon Fraser University.
Perfect. Great. So first, let's talk about just the Fraser River. Can you explain, like, geographically, where is the Fraser River?
Yeah, the Fraser River, it drains about 25% of BC, so it's a huge river and starts way up in the Rocky Mountains and then flows west to Prince George and makes a big turn out there and then flows down through the well-known areas through the Caribou and Williams Lake and Prince George eventually, and then makes its way down to Vancouver. So it's a huge river. That's I forget the exact length of it. I mean, it's in thousands of kilometers long, but it's a central part of BC because it drains so much of the watershed of BC.
And can you talk more about the origins of the flows in the Fraser River?
Yeah, a combination of flows. The flows, they come from obviously glacial melt in the upper headwaters, and a large tributary is like the Nechako River that flows into Prince George, and that's the Nechako is most of the flow in the Nechako comes from the coastal mountains where there's actually the reservoir that forms the reservoir that sends the water to Camano for hydroelectricity generation for the smelter in Kitimat. So that's all snowmelt. So you get snowmelt driven portions. And that's a big chunk of the Fraser, and that's what's so neat about it is that the water can fall in the wintertime, and then it's sort of metered out over the spring freshet, and then gradually melting snow then comes down later on into the summer, and then at some point it goes into base flow and some rain. And so is the in the lower Fraser here, obviously in the wintertime it's basically all is rain, but if you had to look at the majority of where the flow comes from, it comes from snow in the upper part of the watershed because it's a huge interior watershed that gets cold enough to accumulate a lot of snow in the mountains.
Yeah, and can you speak to the ecological importance of the Fraser River?
The Fraser River, from an ecological importance, is spectacular. I mean, in the world today, there's only a handful of large rivers that support the sort of biodiversity that the Fraser does. I mean, it's it's important not just on a local scale, but it's national and international scale. So it has some of the largest salmon runs in the world. Some of the species of large vertebrates we have, they're only found in BC, and they're dependent on fish in the river. And the interconnectedness between the river itself and the glaciated floodplain valley that it's in, and then the avian community, the aquatic community, the terrestrial community, it's a national treasure. I mean, the Fraser to BC is like people talk about the Great Barrier Reef and what an international treasure that is. The Fraser River's in that same category.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the Gravel Reach. So where's the Gravel Reach located?
Yeah, the Gravel Reach of the Fraser is that section of the Fraser essentially from about Hope down to about Chilliwack. You know, if you've ever driven up the Fraser Canyon, you've seen around Hell's Gate, you've seen the river roaring through there, and so it has a lot of energy, and so it moves gravel and sediment of significant sizes down to the lower reaches where the gradient flattens out, and that starts around Hope where the gradient starts to flatten out, and so in that reach from Hope to Chilliwack, that's where the bulk of the heavier pieces, so the gravel settles out, and so that's the Gravel Reach, and then of course the sand, which is the finer particles, they're carried further down, all the way down to Richmond, Stevenson, and that's why you see that typical brown plume in the water at this time of the year when the Fraser's in freshet, and so the fine particles carry all the way down, but the gravel tends to settle out in that low gradient reach between Chilliwack and Hope, and so that's the Gravel Reach.
And so why is the Gravel Reach known as the heart of the Fraser?
It's known as the heart of the Fraser. It was a term that was coined probably 10 or 15 years ago. It was just a way to kind of capture sort of in non-technical terms how important it was. You know, I mean, scientifically it's the Gravel Reach, but in order to sort of capture people's imagination, we came up with that name, the heart of the Fraser, because it really is the functioning. That Gravel Reach is so critical for regional biodiversity in there for both fish and birds and vertebrates, and so the name it really stuck, and then that's kind of where it's at today.
Yeah. So let's go back on that, and could you explain more? How does the heart of the Fraser interact with how does it function in the ecosystem?
The heart of the Fraser, let's call it the gravel reach because then you can sort of wrap your mind around it. It's in BC or in areas where you have glaciated valleys. Basically, what you have is a gravel bed river, what the Fraser is in the gravel reach, and then the gravel bed river is working its way through coursing its way through a big alluvial floodplain, and then it's got mountains on either side. It's kind of U-shaped mountains because the glacier has carved through there. And so the whole, from mountaintop down through the floodplain to the river, across the other floodplain up the mountaintop, it all is functions as one ecological unit. You're often taught at university to be a geomorphologist or be a terrestrial or be an aquatic person in reality. And so educationally wise, we often get siloed into looking at aspects of it, but it functions as one big ecological unit where the biological implications of how the water is doing actually goes from ridgetop to ridgetop, and it's quite amazing when you sort of back off and look at it in the big picture.
How does the gravel reach play a crucial role in fertilizing the vegetation along the Fraser River?
It fertilizes the vegetation in a couple of ways. It's a lot of the nutrient load in the Fraser is driven by returning salmon when they come in and spawn and die, and Pacific salmon, all 5 species, they die when they spawn. And there's a lot of salmon can come into the Fraser in certain years. Some estimates back before the 1913 Hell's Gate slide said that there was 100 million salmon coming back to spawn, and in recent years, I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was runs of 20 million pink salmon. So when they die, spawn after dying, the carcasses get trapped along the banks of the river and on some of the floodplains as the water levels are receding, and then the carcasses essentially decompose, and the carbon in the carcasses and the nutrients sort of filters down into the interstitial spaces between the gravel in the floodplain and the river, and those nutrients directly affect fish and birds that may be scavenging right away. Some scavengers, some birds and carnivores come down. Scavenging vertebrate carnivores carry the nutrients back up into the floodplain and up into the riparian or the forest zone. And some birds can even take parts of it and fly them tens of kilometers either side of it. And so there's a big driver from the salmon carcasses, and then there's other nutrients that are just coming downstream because it's draining a quarter of BC, and so there's nutrients that are actually in the water column, mainly in the form of dissolved organic carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus that come down, and that water kind of gets pushed through the interstitial spaces in the floodplain, and that can feed a microbial community in there that's fed on a myofaunal community that's then fed on emergent insects that are eaten by birds and everything else. So it's quite an amazing integrated sort of ecosystem that one normally you don't see that because we just sort of see the rocks and the gravel. We can't see those parts because you have to start digging it apart and look at it on smaller scale.
Yeah. And talking about that, things that we can't see, the flood pulse concept. It's not something you can as a concept, but can you explain what the flood pulse concept is and how you can see it in the heart of the Fraser?
Yes, the flood pulse concept's been around for a decade and a half or so, maybe 2 decades. And what it is in these large gravel floodplain rivers and also in tropical rivers that you have a seasonal period of high flow. So in the Amazon, you can imagine in the rainy period, and in this part of the world, it's the spring snowmelt freshet that raises the flood level up. Remember, every year we hear about flooding risks in the spring. And what that does, it pushes the river water out into its adjacent floodplain. And that's a key thing, is that a river has to be able to connect with its floodplain. When it does that, it pushes water and nutrients out into the floodplain. Often there's very quick turnover times of various insect life cycles that then when the water recedes, those insects are brought back into the main stem that can feed fish and birds in the main stem, or they're what we find in the case of the Fraser and the Amazon and tropical rivers, that actually fish go out into the floodplain and they forage in the floodplain during that period, and it's an essential part of their life history because they're usually juveniles and they want to get out of the main direct high flow, so they go into the floodplain and they may spend weeks in there feeding because it's a very rich area that's recently been flooded, lots of nutrients, lots of usually invertebrates and things like that. And so that flood pulse concept that you get this annually is what drives and sustains the long-term productivity of these whole gravel bed river floodplain sort of ecosystems. Many people have heard about the Nile River, which has been around since the age of the pharaohs, and every year the Nile would flood, and that's what maintained the productivity of Egypt through the eons. when the Aswan Dam was built in Egypt that stopped the flooding, now they're finding that in those agricultural fields around Egypt that had sustained themselves for thousands of years because the annual flooding of the Nile. They now have to buy agricultural grade fertilizer and put that on the fields because they've lost that annual flooding that comes from that flood pulse concept.
Oh my gosh, wow, it's like a perfect example of what could happen here.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
You know, these ecology, it's like an onion skin. You just keep peeling back, and there's more and more and more every time you look at it.
Yeah, yeah. And, sorry. So, before we move on real quick, I was wondering if we could just have you explain some very basic definitions of some certain words.
Sure.
Right, so we had Mike Church do this earlier as well.
Okay.
Could you explain what a floodplain is?
A floodplain. The best way to think of a floodplain for people that bowl is if you're not a very good bowler, the bowling ball goes down a trench on the side of a bowling alley. That's what's called the thalweg of a river. That's the deepest trench where imagine a bowling ball would flow down a river, and then the floodplain is like the central part of the bowling alley, and so water comes out of that trench and then expands onto the level part of like the bowling deck. That's equivalent with the river trench itself and the floodplain. It's where the river moves to once flows get above a certain stage, which is called a bank full height, and then the river expands out onto the floodplain.
Perfect. And can you explain what rearing habitat is related to fish?
Rearing habitat relative to fish is fish have multiple life stages. You know, they're often in the case of salmonids, they're eggs are laid in the gravel, and then when they emerge, and so that's the incubation phase. When they emerge, then there's a rearing phase that can last for a couple of weeks to a couple of years, and so that's where they're in the juvenile stage before they go to sea, and so they require usually shallower water, slower water, often a little bit warmer water that has more insect invertebrates for them to eat. And so it's kind of like you think of nursery room habitat. It's where the juveniles go before they get big enough to go out to sea, which in the case of salmonids, that's like they're teenagers when they go to sea and become adults. But the rearing area is more like a juvenile space.
Great. And for the uninitiated, what is an invertebrate?
Oh, an invertebrate is just any insect that doesn't have a calcium-based skeleton in it. So they're the ones that have an exterior skeleton, which is called an exoskeleton. So a bee is an invertebrate, an ant is an invertebrate, worms are invertebrate, dragonflies are invertebrates, things like that.
And what does it mean when something's... Sorry, just talking. What does it mean when something is fluvial?
Fluvial?
Yeah.
The definition of fluvial just means that the water is flowing, and so it means it's in a riverine system, so the water is moving usually in one direction, which is kind of the technical definition of river, where water is flowing downhill.
Perfect, yeah. And this will be the last one. Can you explain what a dike is related to the river?
A dike in a river is a structure that humans have made and put along the side of a river in order to have some use of the land on the dry side, where they don't want the water spilling over onto the dry side to influence what's being done. So it could be agricultural land where they don't want it flooded because the tractors would sink into the mud and crops would drown, or it could be a residential area where people have houses where they don't want them being flooded. Like you see every year in the news, sadly, that people, the water level, furniture's floating around in their house, and so the house has been flooded. And so dikes are typically built to prevent loss of things that humans have built. Flooding in a natural sense, the word doesn't exist in a natural world because that's what they did, for millions of years. Flooding is a term that people invented because we put things on floodplains where we shouldn't, and then they get wet, and then the next step is to try and dike it to prevent it from getting wet from the natural floodplain processes.
Perfect, thank you. So, if we can talk a little bit about your past experience with seeing rearing habitat on the Fraser River when we, all of us actually are on the boat tour day. If you can talk about your experience with that when you saw, just before we launched the boats, we saw some fish habitat right there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Rosenau and I were out looking just to see where is the rearing habitat along there, and so when the water's the sort of the color of the Fraser River, it's very difficult to see the fish. So you just have to take a small net. In that case, it's called a pull seine, where you have one person on each end and you just pull the net along with a weighted bottom, and it's kind of like pulling a little tennis net along with you, and then you lift it up to see what's in there. And basically everywhere we looked on that day, we found juvenile salmonids among other species. Chinook, and there was some sockeye, and there was some native minnows and things like that. And I mean, that was an eye-opener for me, because one of the sites we did was a boat launching ramp, and you wouldn't think intuitively that a hardened boat launching ramp is fish habitat, and yet it just goes to show you that with that flood pulse concept, when the water flows are up and that area is recently wetted, that it's all fish habitat and juvenile rearing habitat. And if you don't have habitat for the juveniles, you don't have any adults. So real sort of experience for me to see that, how everywhere we seined, we found juvenile salmonids.
Yeah, it's funny too, because it's like they came at the boat launch. Like, people went, you go on the boat to go fishing to try to find fish, but before you even get on the boat, there's fish already there.
And if there's a metaphor somewhere, you can just think that, I mean, people are just in fish habitat all the time and don't realize it. And that was the real take-home message from there, is that people think, yeah, we got to get in the boat and go 30 kilometers upstream to find fish. Well, as you're back in the trailer in there, you're in fish habitat. It's just it's the size. People are looking for bigger fish, but there's the juvenile fish right there, because that's juvenile rearing habitat.
Yeah.
Kind of cool.
Yeah. Okay, so now we know how great, well, not great, but ecologically valuable and important the gravel reach is, and the Fraser River is in a whole. But can you explain why, right now, currently, the Fraser River could be seen to be in a crisis?
Yeah, the Fraser's in a crisis right now. I mean, it's been, the Fraser has been chipped away at for over 100 years, starting with the Caribou Gold Rush and the famous blockage at the Hell's Gate in 1913, 1914. And then on through the 1950s and 60s and 70s with pulp mills, and there's these sort of tipping points. And so the Fraser's had about 100 odd years, call it from 1870 on, 150 years of abuse, and you can absorb so much. I mean, that's the definition of ecological resiliency: how much stress you can take before you ecosystem changes into a fundamentally different state. And so right now we're at the point, it's kind of at the breaking point, and you hear this all the time now around the planet. You keep hearing things. They've absorbed 150 years of abuse from the Industrial Revolution, and now we're sort of at a tipping point. And so, as I said earlier, there used to be 100 million fish every year come back to the Fraser, 100 million salmon. I mean, we get excited today when there's 10 million. Everybody gets, oh my God, there's 10 million fish coming back. But you think year in and year out, there used to be 100 million fish coming back. And the Fraser was free-flowing. None of the banks were armored. It could access the floodplain, and so at high flows, you'd have the whole ecosystem would be functioning normally. And so we've logged the interior of the Fraser, large parts of the Fraser watershed. There's been pine beetle outbreaks, and so that's affected the change in rainfall runoff. In the upper places, we've put in these large pulp mills that are discharging huge amounts of effluent. I remember reading one paper that said at low flow in March, that 1% of the Fraser River was pulp mill effluent. Kind of a staggering number to keep in the back of your mind. And there are multiple sewage treatment plants that discharge into the Fraser River. The big Anasis wastewater treatment plant out on Anasis Island, that serves over 1 million people. That discharges into the Fraser, as does the plant in Richmond, Metro Vancouver. Those are secondary treatment level plants. And numerous storm drains, and then alteration of the habitat, diking, hardening of the banks. It's the estuary itself. I think the figure's around 75% of the Fraser estuary is lost, and so it's all built up to the point now where it's kind of more or less at the tipping point of ceasing to become the Fraser River that it has been for the last 8,000 years.
Yeah, let's go into more detail about what are the effects of let's go first talking about the pulp mills that are happening. What's the effect that those mills have on the ecology in the river?
The effect of the pulp mills originally was that they were using agents to bleach the paper to make it white, and so that was usually chlorine bleaching, and those were causing disinfection chemical byproducts, dioxins and furans, and so those thankfully were researched, and then the federal government, in an amazing piece of legislation, banned the use of chlorine bleach in in pulp mills in the 1990s and made them switch over to non-chlorine type bleaching. And so, and then all the pulp mills were ordered to go through what was called an environmental effects monitoring program to show the gradual decrease in the level of dioxins and furans that was showing up downstream of the pulp mills. And so that's a problem that manifested itself, was recognized, and then is repaired, and basically is no longer an issue. Same thing down on the lower Fraser. There was a lot of storage yards for wood that was just stored on the banks of the river, and this was dimensional lumber that had been cut and was stored, and it was sprayed with a chemical to prevent mold from growing on it because it's just sitting outdoor and getting rain. It was a anti-sap stain type of chemical, pentachlorophenol, and that when it rained, you imagine it was leaching off the wood into the river, and that was causing a whole series of problems. And so that's been banned. And so, the sort of the pulp mill and the sort of storage of wood issues have more or less been addressed, and so they're no longer a concern thanks to the progressive actions of the federal government, and then initially, and then provincial government got on board and supported that.
How did do you know how that came about? Like, how did they eventually solve this issue? Do you know what steps were taken? Like, how did it come up? Who brought it up, and how was it resolved?
Yeah, it was resolved because there'd been a lot of research going on in how these type of long-lived chemicals, and so the dioxins and furans were sort of very similar in chemical structure to things like DDT, and so usually there's a chlorine ring at the center of the molecule, and they're very persistent. So ever since Rachel Carson in the 1950s and 1960s, when she published her groundbreaking book Silent Spring, brought out and really identified the problems with these modern chemicals that were very persistent, people started looking at them. So there's a lot of scientists looking at the different they're called organochlorines. And so as soon as it wasn't too hard to figure out, if organochlorines are a problem and you're using chlorine in pulp mills to bleach paper to make it white, then downstream of the pulp mill there should be organochlorines in certain forms. It turned out to be dioxins and furans that were in the river, and then that was it goes into the food, and it gets moved up the food web and amplified in the food web. So it wasn't too hard to connect the dots and find it, and so that was really an extension of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring that led to the eventual banning of the chlorine.
Hold on.
Yeah.
There's like a.
Oh, I just paused right here. It just came up.
Oh, that's the red light blinking there.
That's because we only got 4 minutes left on the card.
Oh, perfect. Let's just do this one.
Yeah, let's just.
Roll camera. Okay, great. And okay, so yeah, can you tell me about what are the threats facing the Fraser right now that aren't being addressed and should be?
I guess the biggest threat is climate change on the Fraser watershed on a whole, because that's going to happen on such a large scale, and it started with the pine beetle, with a fair amount of pine beetle have been killed in the watershed, and that's going to change the whole hydrology. And it's going to change the temperature such that the snow that used to fall and then give this gradual seasonal melt of water, the predictions is that we'll have less snow in winter and more rain in winter, and that means the runoff's going to come in winter, and we won't have decent flows in the summertime. And so that's sort of the big picture long-term problem that is a real concern. The more immediate problem is the sort of industrialization of the Fraser, of the diking and the inhibition of the river to sort of wander laterally back and forth as it flows through the gravel reach and down actually in the sand reach as you get more and more human development in the floodplain. And so I'd say climate change is the big picture overall watershed, and so for the lower part of the Fraser in the sand reach and the gravel reach, it's human influence, it's industrialization, agricultural and urbanization in the floodplain.
Yeah, let's go into more detail about that. What do you know of any examples? Can you explain specifically what types of industrialization are happening right now on the gravel reach?
An example of industrialization of the gravel reach is where you start to armor the banks of the river, because what people like to do is they want certainty on what's going to happen on the land base, and so if they want to build a housing development, they will dike it and protect it, and so that's sort of an industrial application that then on the dry side of it, people can do anything. You could farm on it, you could make buildings on it, or you could have factories that were building things. A year or two ago, there was a proposal to put a toxic waste disposal facility out on the floodplain of the Fraser River, and there's a huge public backlash against that. And so, I mean, there's a classic example of what you don't want to do in a floodplain is have a toxic waste disposal facility, a regional for the Lower Mainland toxic waste disposal facility built on a floodplain. I mean, the question everybody asked was, so what happens when if the dike breaks and it floods? I mean, you shouldn't build things that are going to cause problems on floodplains if a dike breaks, because invariably they will.
Yeah. And can you explain the different islands and areas in the gravel reach that are under threat right now?
Yeah, there's a series of islands in the gravel reach, and that's just the nature of geomorphically how islands in this sort of floodplain where you've got these gravel bed rivers. I mean, the river is like a snake that just sort of laterally weaves its way down the river through the gravel, and it's laterally moving at all times. And so on the outside edge, there's erosion takes place, and the river moves that way. And on the inside edge, because the water velocity slows down, you get deposition. And so rivers are constantly changing, like a giant anaconda moving back and forth. And it needs to have the room to go back and forth. As soon as you constrain the sides of it by diking, then the river can no longer do that. And when you upset that, it just sets into effect a whole chain reaction that if, those geomorphic changes then influence have very negative consequences on the spatial temporal mechanisms that control the habitat mosaic on the floodplain, and that habitat mosaic is what gives it such high regional biodiversity, and then ecosystem scale ecological integrity. And so as soon as you start inhibiting a river's ability in a gravel floodplain valley to move back and forth, then you start to restrict its ability to support the regional biodiversity that it had.
And can you talk more about what's happening with the Harrington Islands right now, and the Carey Islands?
Yeah, there's the series of islands like Hurling Island and Carey Island, Strawberry Island. There's other unnamed islands. Some of those islands, Hurling and Carey, had been used as fairly low intensity pulpwood islands. They were owned by Kruger Paper, and they were run under a tree farm license, and so they were quasi plantations for softwood, cottonwood type trees, and they'd be allowed to grow for 30 or 40 years, relatively fast growing, and then they would be cut down and then used to make various paper products at the mill that was Kruger Mill that was out in New Westminster. Recently, in the last year or so, those islands were sold, so they no longer belong to Kruger Paper, and they were clear cut, and then they're in the process of being converted into agricultural use. And so that's a use that's not really compatible with being in a floodplain, because a tree farm license that's seasonally flooded during high flows and freshet, and then the water dropped down, I mean, it's not a pristine use but it's probably the only non-natural use of the islands that could be compatible with maintaining the ecological integrity of the gravel reach. But as soon as you start to farm it, then of course if you're farming something, you no longer want water on the land, because you can't farm water that's underwater. And so that then means diking, which then sets this whole chain reaction of you start to dike it, which starts to inhibit the lateral movement of the river, and it changes it changes the speed of the river, and you get deeper erosion, and so on. And so that's an example of what's going on in Hurling and Carey Islands that is incompatible with maintaining the ecological integrity.
So you're saying the only, in your opinion, what forms of, like you're saying, the tree farming it's not pristine, but it could. What forms of industrialization or development could happen on the Fraser that wouldn't cause such a dramatic effect? And do they exist or they don't exist right now?
Yeah, the only forms of activity that would be compatible in the gravel reach is just that sort of low intensity forestry that was allowing floodplain trees to grow and then occasionally be harvested, because that's there's very few human uses that can put up with seasonal flooding, and so basically that's the only one that can, because the trees don't mind, because they're in there for 30 or 40 years and you're waiting them to get big enough to cut. And so really the river and the floodplain should and the riparian should all be looked at one big ecological unit that's integrated, and it should have zero human influence in there and be left as a protected area or wildlife management area or something like that. And so, but the only thing that you could look at that you could live with to get get some sort of benefit other than the natural ecological integrity in terms of getting some sort of cash value out of it would be the forestry. Agriculture is not compatible, industrial development is not compatible, residential development is not compatible, because if they flood, then they're all degraded. So there's a very tiny number of compatible things that can go on in a floodplain.
And can we get into more detail about what are the ecological effects of the clear cutting?
When you clear cut an island, I mean, clear cuts are not, in and of themselves are kind of a replication of a natural process that goes on. I mean, in forest, you get through time, you get forest fires, you get insect outbreaks, and so sort of patchwork sort of removal of a forest cover is a perfectly natural thing. And in the case of the islands in the heart of the Fraser, if parts of them were logged on a rotational scale every 30 or 40 years, so is that kind of patchwork, then that's more or less not a huge deal. That's what these forests would go through in themselves. The immediate effects is that when you take away the forest cover, you get more rainfall actually hits the ground, because normally when there's a tree canopy, a percentage, maybe around 30% of precipitation, either snow or rain, never reaches the forest floor. It gets evapotranspired in the atmosphere, and so that actually reduces the amount of runoff you get. Not so much a case here, but it's sort of in urban areas, that's a big issue. And you do get some disruption if you have heavy machinery in there. You'll cause you'll break the surface covers so that there'll be some silt runoff generated from that. But usually those things recover fairly quickly. Those are temporal disturbances that could happen naturally. I mean, if a lightning bolt hit the middle of Carey Island and there was no human ever around, it would cause a fire, it would burn, the trees would go, there'd be a little disruption. If you went back 10 or 15 years, you probably wouldn't notice it. So low intensity forest use doesn't generate, if it's done correctly, that many lasting environmental issues. It does have some short term in terms of sediment disruption, how the wood is accessed, how it's got in and out of that, if they have to barge it in or put temporary bridges or things like that. But the fact that it mimics a natural process is not a huge cause for concern.
And what are the ecological effects of agricultural development, agricultural farming?
The main ecological effect of agricultural farming on an island in a floodplain is that because the island has to be dry in order to grow crops and get the machinery on it to get the crops off, is that it restricts the lateral movement of the river, and so that again affects the river's ability to transport sediment and gravel downstream, and the movement of water in and out of the the river bottom. It's called the hyperrheic zone, where nutrients and water gets pushed down and comes up in upwelling zones, which could be fish spawning habitat. And so it's really not compatible, because as you carve out a little area for agriculture, it has consequences across the river, because you're now restricting the ability of the river to do its gradual movement as they move back and forth. And I think the time frame of the lateral movement on the Fraser is that any of those islands in the Fraser have a lifespan of around 250 years. And so if you had a time-lapse camera that was running for 250 years, you'd see Hurling and Carey Island formed and then disappear in a time frame of 250 years, and you'd see a couple other islands form and disappear. So as soon as you try and dike them, then that whole process gets constrained, and then the river starts causing more and more scouring and upsets again that sort of habitat mosaic that provides such a high biodiversity in the area, and gives you that sort of the number of birds, avian, terrestrial, and fish species that inhabit that area.
Yeah, so essentially if anyone were to make any buildings or of any kind on the islands in the gravel reach, they'd be building something, making a building on like a time bomb, right? Eventually it's gonna run over. But as you've said, if they make any, such as diking, or they do anything to stop the removal of the land, it's gonna affect the whole Fraser River.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you build something on an island, then you want to hold on to what you built, because you've spent some real dollars on doing it, and then because you've got water that goes up and down on a seasonal scale for shed. I mean, it's the next thing you do is you dike it to protect it. You protect your investment, and the protection of the investment. People are just thinking, well, it's just me and my investment and my protection, but usually it's the taxpayer who pays for the pays for the dikes, and then the ecological consequences are borne by all of the taxpayers, and that's not factored in anywhere into the equation. I mean, and that's a loss of ecosystem goods and services that's it's not full cost accounting. And so the diking, so the individual, the agriculture benefits, society benefits to some degree if they're eating the crops that come off it. But if it's an export crop to China, I mean, there's no local benefit from that, and yet the taxpayers pay for the dikes, and that the citizens of BC and Canada as a whole would lose the ecosystem goods and services that would have emanated from having a functional river moving within its natural floodplain.
And how much development is it going to take on the gravel reach? If development continues and increases, how much development would it take for all of the gravel reach to be lost?
The amount of development basically of Hurling Island and Carey Island, that's more or less, we talked earlier that the Fraser's at a tipping point. All of the biological sampling has been out that shows that is the critical, and that's where that term heart of the Fraser comes from, for salmon spawning in the gravel reach, for sturgeon spawning, that if those islands are industrialized and it changes the geomorphic processes in that area, then that basically is the beginning of the end for the gravel reach, and in essence the regional biodiversity there will begin to unravel at a greatly accelerated rate. So this is a real sort of no-go point in terms of the long-term future of the Fraser River as we know it.
Yeah, and can you go into more detail about the I guess butterfly effect, or the chain of events that will happen if the gravel reach is completely developed? How is that going to affect the Fraser River? And
as the gravel reach gets developed, that will, if the area is developed in the dike, that will speed up the river. The gravel that's in there now will get the river will accelerate and erode deeper, and that will cause other islands to fall into it, and so you'll lose those large sort of gravel beds that are spawned on in the fall by pink salmon and then juvenile rearing area, and so we'll continue to see this accelerating loss of salmonids. I mean, we've gone from 100 million salmon every year to, I think last year there's just a couple of million salmon came back in the Fraser. So I mean, we're already down to the less than 5% what used to be there. And then if we do this, then basically we drop down to sub 1% level. I mean, we've already seen the southern resident killer whales are in deep trouble. There's one died a few weeks ago. There's only 76 left. I mean, they're heavily dependent on Chinook salmon for their diet. And as goes the spawning habitat and rearing habitat in the Fraser for salmonids, particularly Chinook salmon, there goes our southern resident killer whales. I mean, they're linked. I mean, it's this critical spawning area and a juvenile rearing area. And if you take that out of the salmon life cycle, then it really is the beginning of the end in terms of this, amazing natural benefits that the Fraser used to add. Everybody associates the Fraser River with salmon. Well, that is going to come to an end as the heart of the Fraser becomes industrialized.
yeah, and I remember earlier we were talking about this was a couple months ago, but you were showing us the almost extinction rates that's happening to some certain species of fish. Can you talk more about that? What kind of, from your experience and what you've seen, what kind of species of aquatic invertebrates or fish are under threat of extermination? Yeah,
what's under threat is all the salmonids in the Fraser. I mean, the sockeye are at record lows. I mean, there was a Cohen Commission on investigation of missing sockeye a few years ago because the sockeye had gone down so much. Many interior coho stocks are listed as endangered. Recently this year, we've had most of the interior Fraser and Thompson Chilcotin steelhead were listed. I mean, there's only a couple of hundred in the Nicola and the Bonaparte and the Deadman and the Chilcotin. I mean, just a couple of hundred steelhead from several thousands a few decades ago. Chinook salmon already indicated, primary salmonid prey item for southern resident orcas. They're in trouble. I mean, all of the salmonids are in trouble. Again, we're down in the sub 5% level from what we used to see prior to 1913.
Has it been getting worse over the years? Has the rates been getting lower?
Oh yeah, you follow the trends over time. I mean, and it's not only salmon; it's ooligan. I mean, ooligan were a critical fish, food fish, and for multiple uses for First Nations. I mean, Ooligan are all but extinct in the Lower Fraser. Sturgeon, the gigantic, long-lived Fraser River white sturgeon, is down at small levels compared to what it used to be. I mean, they were fished out in the 1890s. I mean, these fish live up to 150 years and get up to 500 kilos in weight. Those large, long-lived sort of fish, they're at a fraction of their former size, and so it's pretty tough to look around at any fish species in the Fraser and see anything that had a significant ecological role that's doing well these days. It's not, there isn't an equivalent like starlings. Thank God we haven't got any invasive fish in the Fraser that have filled in the niche that's been caused by the loss of our native salmonids.
And so now that there's a crisis going on, let's explain what's being done right now. What groups are trying to fix the Fraser, or what policies are trying to be made?
Well, there are some existing policies. There's a Federal Fisheries Act that was severely degraded under the Conservative government of the last several years, and so the new Liberal government has indicated that they're going to rewrite the Federal Fisheries Act to protect it. There are some provincial legislation around riparian area protection and some land use guidelines, and of course municipalities and regional districts influence regional land use and zoning. The net result is that it hasn't slowed it down, because it's usually you've got multiple jurisdictions, everybody's in their silo, and the net result of it is that developers can kind of pick and choose who they talk to, and then you get this incremental loss. And so there's no big picture view that any level of government is doing or put it in their mandate to say that, look, we're going to protect or save the heart of the Fraser. So the sad reality is that government isn't doing much, although it could. The legislation's there, but legislation's only as good as it's enforced. And so most of the investment in raising the issues about what's going on in the Fraser and the heart of the Fraser Reach is being done by non-governmental organizations and First Nations.
And in your opinion, do you feel that the heart of the Fraser or the Gravel Reach is being mismanaged?
Yeah, there's no question it's being mismanaged, because there seems to be more and more industrial use. There's gravel extraction, which is clearly contrary to maintaining its role as a key spawning and nursery area. There are conversions of the tree farm licenses on Hurling and Carey Island, which, as we talked about earlier, was a suitable low intensity sort of industrial use into higher intensity industrial use in the form of agriculture. And who knows, possibly residential housing in the future. I mean, we all know there's a housing crisis, and so, somebody can imagine making a good sales pitch to the local government that, yeah, we'll build 5,000 houses on Hurling Island and sell them at sub-market prices and solve the housing crisis. Well, that's great. That may solve the housing crisis, but then you have to build a gigantic dike around it to protect them, and then that ends up failing at some time and flooding out all those 5,000 houses that you built. And then in the meantime, the Fraser River's ecological integrity is unraveled, and we've lost yet more salmon and more sturgeon spawning habitats. So, not a good scenario from where you look at it right now.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about, well, basically, what makes the heart of the Fraser one of the most vulnerable and endangered habitats in the world? Like you were comparing it to the coral reef, or even places like the Nile River that are very revered. But should the Fraser River, and specifically the heart of the Fraser Gravel Reach, have more notoriety, and why should it?
It should be famous on an international scale, but like a lot of things, you always tend to look at something that's famous somewhere else, and things that are in your own backyard right under your nose, we tend to overlook. And that's, you've always heard about, you have to bring in an expert from elsewhere to sort of tell you what you already know. Well, I mean, the Fraser, I mean, when I travel around the world and I'm in Europe, or I'm in down the US or in Australia, New Zealand, I mean, everybody talks about the Fraser River, what a magnificent ecosystem it is, and yet right here we just think it's just a river that we can dump sewage discharge into and industrialize it, and don't pay enough attention to it. So it's funny, I think, because it's right here and people get used to it. there's another facet of this that comes into it called the shifting baseline syndrome, that people only view the Fraser and how they've seen it when they first saw it, and so most people today have never seen huge runs of salmon on the Fraser that literally you could walk across the river on the backs of the Fraser, and so all they've seen is closures and no fish. And so that shifting baseline kind of feeds into it. And then the third thing is that it just sadly happens to be located right in the middle of BC's biggest metropolitan zone. I mean, I think we're coming up to 5 million people in BC, and of that 5 million, half of them live in the Greater Vancouver Regional District and in the Fraser Valley Regional District. And so you just got this burgeoning population that needs more space for farming, roads, McDonald's, Tim Hortons, etc. So it happens to be in a place where there's just a huge push because of the people density that's down here that's growing, and the population's growing. Population in the Lower Mainland, Metro Vancouver Regional District is growing at 60,000 people every year, and those people need houses and they need activities and skating rinks and McDonald's and so on, and that lends a push to develop more land area, and they start encroaching into floodplains, and that's what gets you into trouble.
Do you think in your lifetime that the land developers will ever recognize the ecological importance of the gravel reach?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you're in the land development industry for one reason, and that's to make money. So I mean, there's no chance in the world that a land developer, who's in it for a profit margin, whatever, they make money by developing land. And so the only way to protect these things is either you find some land use that's compatible with functioning environment, or legislation prevents development on them, so they get put into a protected area, whether it be a park or wildlife management area, or they're purchased outright by some NGO like Nature Trust or Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, and they're set aside as ecological reserves.
Yeah, and can you, now let's talk about those organizations, NGO and the Habitat.
How many questions do you have?
We got another 15. Swap card.
No, keep going. That's
Yeah.
fine.
Okay, so what can you give? What organizations are in the area that are trying to help the Fraser River? We can go in order.
Sure. The main organization, NGO, that's helping out right now is the BC Wildlife Federation, and so they're very concerned about the loss of habitat. And BC Wildlife Federation is a lot of the conservationists in BC. There's around 65,000 people in the BC Wildlife Federation, so they're sort of leading the charge to protect the heart of the Fraser. Watershed Watch is another NGO that's interested in salmonid habitat and ecology, and so they're playing a key role in here. I know Eco-Justice is interested in sort of, whether these are sort of legal uses of conversion of tree farm licenses into agricultural, and then there are various smaller scale groups on a sub-regional scale that are interested.
So, can you explain your history with the Saving the Heart of the Fraser campaign?
My history has been involved, I was born and raised in BC, and so I fished in the Fraser River all my life, so we're getting on past half a century now. But it's really just and so shifting baseline was, I remember when there were huge runs of salmon into the Fraser, and we used to go catch them, and so it's just the sort of the accelerating loss in the last, really since I guess about the last decade, have seen things continue to wind down, that there's fewer and fewer salmon to catch. Even in the 1980s, things were not that bad, even though the pulp mill problem had not been solved by then. That really got solved in the 1990s. And so it's from the 1990s on and really into the 2000s where you as you saw more problems, the disappearance of the ooligans, the collapse of the salmonid populations, the sort of the small numbers of large adult sturgeon in there, and becoming and partially just becoming more educated about what's going on and understanding how the world works. So I mean, I've been involved with the Fraser for half a century, but from an academic and personal, it's been the last 10 or 15 years where it's really been alarming what's happening.
Correct. So, all right. Can you explain what is the BCIT's River Institute?
The BCIT Rivers Institute is a privately funded institute by Rudy North, who's a very, very generous benefactor who is a local Vancouver resident, and so he funds the Rivers Institute to sort of raise the sort of the profile of rivers, lakes, streams, estuaries in BC, and that provides for desk space and partial salary support for myself and one other person at BCIT here, and we're blended into the ecological restoration program so that I teach part-time, and then the other half of my time it's involved in the Rivers Institute, which is then essentially lending your educational and technical expertise to groups that want to do things to protect and restore various aquatic habitats, whether they be rivers, lakes, estuaries, or wetlands.
So, what brought you to the BCIT Rivers Institute?
I ended up at the Rivers Institute. I saw there was an ad in the paper. I'd been working in provincial government for 25 years doing habitat restoration work. Had probably the best combination of education and practical experience that nobody will ever be able to replicate. I was basically in university for 24 years and working simultaneously for 25 years, and so that means I was almost had about 50 years of experience. And then after 25 years, the provincial government changed its focus and greatly reduced the role of field biology that you do. So in 2005, when we were told that we would no longer be doing any field work, I decided it was time to pack my bags and go look for brighter pastures. And I thought one of the best things that I could do would then be able to teach and use the benefit of the incredible experiences that I had back in the day when government actually got out and did a lot of fish and wildlife field work, and use that to train the next generation of biologists so that they would be able to benefit from my experience.
Yeah, can you tell me more about that? Why is it important to continue to educate more people about it?
Well, I think there's, again, it's a shifting baseline thing. It's just pervasive. I think a lot of people just think that they have to accept the status quo of the degraded fish habitat. And, I mean, I'm old enough that I've seen it when it wasn't all that degraded, but even when I saw it, that was a fraction of what, my grandparents would have seen it. So I realize I've had kind of been a unique born in 1954, so I've got a unique perspective on things because everybody acknowledges the 1950s was kind of the inflection point and how the Industrial Revolution kind of went into overdrive, and so I saw it through the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. I hate to sound like I've been around that long, but that's allowed sort of a kind of a unique perspective on how things have changed. I mean, even in the 1960s, many more people used to hunt and fish and get outside and saw the resource as an integral part of being a British Columbia citizen or a Canadian. Today, there's still a lot of people that like to go out and birdwatch and camp and hike and things like this, but that actual connection, old style Aldo Leopold connection to the landscape has disappeared because of shifting baseline, because there's nothing to get connected to in the first place. I find that sad. That's happened if you go around the world, China, Japan, parts of Russia, U.S. I mean, the ecosystems around the world are just winding down. We're in the midst of what's called the sixth great extinction right now. There's been 5 previous ones, all caused by various meteor impacts and sort of global cataclysms. This one is being caused by humans. Climate change, being the main driver right now. And so I want to use what I've been able to learn and see over the last over my career, which is extended over a long time, and so at least some of the students will get it and hopefully pick up the torch and make sure that there's voices that have scientific and technical reasoning that can speak to governments and help develop policies, speak to the public, and help protect and restore some of the habitat that we used to have.
Well, clearly, mentally and physically, you've invested so much time into specifically the well-being of the Fraser and the environment. Can you explain why the environment is personally important to you and what's kept you on?
Well, my dad always used to say that you get a job that you'd get a job doing something that you like to do for free because you enjoy, and then figure out a way to get paid for it. So in this case, being able to be outside and and experiencing the amazing biodiversity in BC. I mean, most people go out and, on long weekends, they go crazy and go camping and get out, and then they're back in a cubicle working for the next 5 or 10 days, right? And they get loose on weekends. This kind of work got me outside all the time, so I'd come home on weekends to recover because I'd been out in the field for 5 days. So you're exactly the opposite of an increasingly urban population that's experiencing what we call nature deficit disorder. And so I just found it more enjoyable to be out and about in about nature, and figured out a way to get paid to do it.
Mm-hmm. And I guess going over that Can you talk more about the, I guess, importance of trying to merge, like how, because it almost seems, some people could think that it's inevitable that places like the Fraser River and the Gravel Reach are going to get industrialized, and if it's lost, it's lost, because people need to make way for the influx of so many people that are coming in, or for businesses, or for profits. How do you, what's it gonna take, do you think, for people to really understand or get value out of the Fraser River, out of its natural state, not just profit?
Yeah, it's really just a societal choice in what people want. I mean, several years ago, I participated in a project called the Salmon 2100 project, where we were asked by Bob Lackey, who worked for the U.S. EPA. He was putting a book out and saying, what are wild salmon going to be like in the year 2100 in the Pacific Northwest? And each author, there was about 30 authors, asked to say what were they going to be like and what could be done to change it. And really what it showed is it's just a societal choice. I mean, if people want to have, you know, drive-in movies and a coffee shop and a donut shop and a supermarket and a skating rink on every street corner, that's a societal choice that they make. And so it's valued more than the natural environment. I mean, the problem is we're very good at valuing things that, you know, part of the capitalist system that make money. We're just in the last decade or so starting to realize the value of natural capital, and particularly in the engineering infrastructure world for watersheds to prevent flooding in urban areas, and that people are realizing that the value of trees and things that can absorb water and creeks, you can valuate them, and they come out at a staggering value once you start putting a number on it. And so it really comes down to what do people want, and that's a societal choice. We have all the science and technology in the world to restore most of these sites. It's really just a question of what people want, and increasingly urban populations that are disconnected from nature tend to not pay as much attention to it, and that's the concern that as time goes on, there would be a point where it goes past a tipping point, and then we lose the sort of the salmon runs in the Fraser River. I mean, all it would take would be one dam in the Fraser River up at the Moran site, where BC Hydro wanted to put a dam in there in the 1950s, and that would have been it for the Fraser River. But there was a huge pushback at the time, led by Roderick Haig Brown, who was a famous sort of court magistrate up in Campbell River. And we only need to look south to the Columbia River, where there's dozens of main stem dams on the Columbia, and so they've had you know, similar major reductions in their fish populations. And yet, strangely enough, they're doing massive salmon restoration projects led by First Nations court decisions that under the treaty entitlement that now they've been sued and are successfully doing major salmon restoration. And the amount of big-scale salmon restoration we're doing in BC, both federally and provincially, it's just minuscule compared to what's happening south of the border.
Yeah. Well, you were saying that ultimately it's a choice whether or not the Fraser River should be saved. The Gravel Reach should be saved, ultimately, I would think, Fraser River. But what makes you come up with your choice and your decision?
Oh, to me, there's not an instant where I thought otherwise. Is that realizing the value? You know, if you sort of extrapolate forward the value of the ecosystem benefits in terms of clean water, clean air by having functioning riparian forest. And if you want to put a cash value on the amount of salmon, just the dollar value when it's sold. I mean, when there's a big sockeye run that maybe exceeds, say, 10 or 15 million on the Fraser River, I mean, it just transforms the whole economy of BC. It drives fishing companies, it drives recreational. We even see it in the provincial government, the number of people that buys fishing licenses. There's a big spike every 4 years as the Adams River dominant run comes in. And if you go and talk to anybody in the Fraser Valley, they'd say that, you know, salmon is you know, in cycle years, salmon becomes the dominant economic driver. So, you know, if we lost that, then basically you're going to lose that huge amount of social, environmental, and economic benefit that was associated with it. And I think that would be sad to see that we had one of the nature's treasures in our, and let it slip between our fingers in our lifetime, which is essentially what's happening.
Yeah, and I guess my final question here is, can you just talk more about the communities of people, whether that you've seen in your life or just around BC that are affected by the Gravel Reach?
The communities that are affected by the gravel reach, I mean, there's the communities in the Fraser Valley that have usually mistakenly built in the floodplain, that sort of live in fear of annual flooding, and that's what happens when you build a floodplain. I mean, you shouldn't build there in the first place. They learned this the hard way in the Mississippi, where they're taking buildings out of the floodplain and moving on the higher ground, and they're allowing floodplains to flood seasonally. So there's sort of as land prices, are higher in Vancouver, there's a push out in the Fraser Valley. A fair amount of the land is reserved and protected under the Agricultural Reserve Act. But other areas, there's always this push by developers to develop land for industrial purposes, and that's this sort of continued erosion or pushing into floodplain habitat that should be left alone. First Nations obviously have the most to lose in this, because although there may be some economic benefits of building something in a floodplain that provides some capital return, First Nations have existed for millennia on the annual cycle of salmon coming back, and it's woven into the Coast Salish. I mean, there's probably nothing more connected to Coast Salish people's culture than salmon. Recreationally, people like to go out hunt and fish, bird watch. Anybody that enjoys the outdoors would lose out if there's a loss of the ecosystem benefits in the heart of the Fraser. So cash-wise, I think if you actually did a proper full cost accounting on what it would be, and if you sort of looked out hundreds of years, I mean, what you'd gain by short-term industrial development would be dwarfed by the long-term return on investment you get by protecting it.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
That cover enough? Is that a couple of gigabytes?
Yeah,
Give you something to chew on?
Quite a bit of
Yeah, we've got a transfer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. It's like a thief.